One way to look fascinating is always write about and surround yourself with fascinating people, and somehow people think you're fascinating. I want to thank Eric, as everybody I'm sure knows. His book comes out in about 4 weeks, Madison Park. Give a shout out to Larry Kirschbaum, who agented it, published it, God, heaven knows, shepherded it. And I saw Larry in New York a couple nights ago, and he came here for this, and we'll be here for some of Eric's events. Thank you, Larry, for doing it. And thank you, Alma and Joe Gildenhorn, and all our friends from Y, like Phil. We are going to find ways to keep Y going. Don't worry, we'll figure this out. So, having written about so many very, very smart people, and then hung around Aspen Ideas Festival with so many smart people, it began to occur to me that there were a lot of smart people in this world. It also began to occur to me that often they don't amount to much. What really matters is being creative and imaginative. And I looked back at the books I had written, starting with Benjamin Franklin, and I realized that there was a common theme. And it wasn't just being smart, it was being creative. It was trying to define creativity and explain how we can achieve it. And the pattern that I saw, took me a while to find it out, was that these people saw patterns. In other words, Benjamin Franklin loved every topic there was. He loved electricity, he loved the Gulf Stream, he loved how you put together governments. He would ride up and down the coast when he was forming the U.S. postal system and have his horse go into whirlwinds so he could measure how whirlwinds work, and that helped him figure out the Gulf Stream, and his sense of science helped him figure out the balances of the Enlightenment that came enshrined in our Constitution. Likewise, Einstein, when he was trying to figure out the harmonies of the spheres and was having trouble with his equations on relativity, would pull out his violin and play Mozart because it connected him with those harmonies. And for Steve Jobs, every time he ended a product presentation, he would show an intersection of 2 street signs, that of the arts and that of engineering, the liberal arts and technology, arts and sciences. And in a day and age in which we think that everybody should specialize, and we try to beat into our children that they have to have STEM education, forgetting that the arts and the humanities are what make us creative, it occurred to me that I should try to write about the ultimate icon, not only of creativity, because I do think he was the most creative genius in history, but the ultimate icon, the ultimate embodiment of somebody who combines the arts and the sciences, combines the humanities and technology. Let me wait for Garrett to come in late. So by combining the arts and the humanities in that way, in a way symbolized by Vitruvian man, I think he was able to see the cross currents and the patterns of nature. And I wanted to help myself, but also try to describe how that happens, how somebody wills himself, makes himself creative. Because the interesting thing about Leonardo is that he was not touched by lightning and have a superhuman processing power the way an Einstein did. He was somebody who every day woke up and wrote in his notebook things like, why is the sky blue? How do the wings of a dragonfly work? All the types of just pure curiosity that I think helped make him creative. He had the great good fortune to be born out of wedlock. Had he been legitimate, he would have had to have been a notary, like his father and grandfather and great-grandfather, and he would not have been a good notary. He really did not like to do things by rote. Also, by being born illegitimately, he did not get sent to one of the classical schools or universities that aspiring sons of the upper middle class were sent to in the 1450s in Florence and this town of Vinci. He was born in the village of Vinci, just outside of Florence. And as a kid, because he was not going to school, decided he had to teach himself. And he found himself curious about every aspect of nature, especially looking at the little rivers around Vinci that flow into the Arno, looking at the swirls, seeing how they form, seeing that swirling pattern in things like leaves and plants. And throughout his life, that spiral, swirling, flowing movement of emotions and motions become a theme of who Leonardo is. As a young kid, at about age 12, he goes to Florence nearby because his father brings him to Florence. Florence was then a city we can learn from because it becomes the cradle of creativity in the Renaissance. Why? Because it was tolerant and it was diverse and it had trade, it had banking, it had immigration, it had people from all over Europe, but also the Arab world, because of Constantinople was falling the year Leonardo was born, and they're bringing back algebra and other wonderful insights from the Arab world. Leonardo is a bit of a misfit. He's gay, he's left-handed, he's heretical, he's illegitimate, and yet he's perfectly comfortable in Florence, wearing his purple and his pink clothing, parading around town, and you have a mix of different people who live in Florence, and a mix of different talents, and even you have workshops like the one he gets apprenticed to, where jewelry makers and gold beaters are working with cloth merchants and mathematicians, architects and artists to do things like, in Leonardo's case, when he's a young kid, there's the famous dome of the Duomo, the cathedral. That copper ball, when he's a teenager, Verrocchio has to design ways to solder that ball, use concave mirrors to concentrate the rays of the sun, machinery to lift it up, and art to make it beautiful. That combination of art and engineering, of different talents, flourishes in Florence. And it's a perfect place for Leonardo. He's a good-looking kid. When he first becomes an apprentice at approximately age 12 or 13, Verrocchio sculpts David, a very young David. We have a picture of done by another of the apprentices in the shop, of Leonardo posing for David. So we know exactly what he looks like. And this is a little drawing in the bottom right-hand corner of the Adoration of the Magi, where artists would put a self-portrait, and this is Leonardo drawing a portrait of himself at around that age when he was young. So we know what Leonardo looked like, and we know that one of the main things he did before he becomes a painter in the studio is he loves theater. Theater design, pageants, outdoor spectacles. It's what was keeping the Medicis in power in Florence, is in the days before TV and movies and everything else. The entertainment at night was plays and pageants. At one point, the Duke of Milan is coming for a visit. They put on a lot of spectacles. Here's Verrocchio's design. And here's one of the first drawings ever by Leonardo, where people think it was a piece of art. I realized by reading his notebooks that it was a design for the costumes of the people who were going to be marching in the parade for the Duke of Milan. It's this craggy old warrior, which Leonardo loved to draw, with everything from the fantasies of dragon wings and lions' heads, and all in these beautiful costumes. When I realized what a great theater designer he was and the importance of theater and pageant to his work, certain things became clear. This is a famous drawing. People say it's Leonardo. He invented the helicopter. Well, no. This was actually done for a play in Florence to bring the angels down from the rafters. It has that wonderful spiral design that Leonardo loves so much, from rivers and waters and fluids and air and the swirls that even made stabs at the Fibonacci's equations that underlie the math of that. But he draws this for a theater production It's supposed to transport the imagination, not humans. But the cool thing about Leonardo is there's always blurred lines, whether the sfumato of his paintings or the blurring between reality and fantasy. Once he's interested in designs like this, he decides to make real flying machines. He turns his art into engineering and his fantasies into inventions and new objects. To see the type of movement he does in painting, these are two paintings of Tobias and the Angel, done approximately the same time when Leonardo was very young, a young kid working as an apprentice in the shop. This is the one done by Verrocchio's shop. And let's remember, when I say shop, painting was a collaborative endeavor back then. This is before great geniuses did their paintings and signed their work. They'd all churn these things out, and Leonardo would be assigned parts of the picture. But he learned that innovation involved teamwork. And this is the competing studio down the street, Palaiolo's studio. And if you look at the way Leonardo, who drew the dog, who drew Tobias, the face and the turning neck here, we know some of what was Leonardo's, what were others in the studio, draws the river that flows right into the movement of humans, connecting us to our earth and our cosmos in a holistic thing. If you even see the sprightliness of the dog, how different it is from the flat, motionless, and emotionless paintings of his competitors. So we first start seeing that Leonardo connecting motion with emotion in his paintings. Likewise, another painting done by Verrocchio's studio. In this case, Leonardo has painted this angel, so different from the one that Verrocchio himself painted. This one is filled with emotion, movement. The only emotion on the angel of this face is, how did I get stuck here next to a more amazing angel? Once again, the curves of the river, the curves and swirls of rivers from the eons of history coming down to today. Leonardo, ever since he's a kid playing in the little rivers of Vinci as a little boy, that's what he loves, and he loves it connecting to us. It's called the macrocosm-microcosm connection. The microcosm of the human connected to the macrocosm of creation. How are we all part of one thing? To him, the flow of rivers into our blood symbolizes it, and especially in this case where the river flows, and as Leonardo draws, is poured over the head of Jesus into him, and then ripples down into the River Jordan, and scientifically, accurately, with unbelievable beauty. If you just look at the details of the water rippling past the ankles of Christ, how the ripples and swirls are done precisely right. Some of us this evening are going to go to the National Gallery. This is the only painting publicly displayed in North America, Ginevra da Vinci. It is a work of a very young Leonardo. It is a very good painting, and with all due respect to the National Gallery, it's not the masterpiece that the Mona Lisa is. But it's got the elements of the Mona Lisa. It may not be the Mona Lisa, but it's clearly drawn by the very young artist who would go on to paint the Mona Lisa. Without over-saying it, I will say once again, we see the rivers coming from the eons of history and connecting into the human. We see curls of hair because the curls and swirls that he loved become a passion for the curls with the light making spots of luster on it. Somewhat emotionless, he hasn't yet perfected how to do the mysterious smile or the eyes that exactly follow you. That will take a lifetime of science, math, and anatomy for him to get that right. But it is a three-quarter profile of a wife of a middle-class cloth merchant, and so too will be his culminating painting, a three-quarters profile of the wife of a middle-class cloth merchant. And we will see all the things he does between then and the Mona Lisa that will end up culminating in the Mona Lisa. Once again, as he's trying to create things, he does the swirl. That's a narrative. There's the little picture of him I showed you earlier That's him right there. But it does a swirl, that pattern. And here is something he's trying to invent. Besides three-dimensionality and swirling, that paintings are not still lives. They are not a snapshot. They are not just a moment in time. He said moments of time don't exist. Like Einstein, he realizes that every moment has what came right before it and what came right after it. There's no distinct lines between different moments. So he's showing, as all of his paintings tend to do, a narrative drama, a movement. The second king offering the gift, but the first king has already offered it, bowing down. Because of that, the shock on Joseph's head as all this is happening. And even each one of these things, you go as if you're looking at a narrative, in fact, a dramatic narrative as if it were on stage. One problem with this painting is it's not finished, and this is a very Leonardo thing. He was a genius, but he was not a regular old craftsman. He did not churn it out. And what he has is every single emotion on every face affects the motion of the next person in the spiral, but so does the light. Not only are there shadows that he's trying to do, but he has realized by this point with his studies of optics that reflected light off of objects color the shadows of the objects next to him. He's getting himself all worked up in the drawings of this, and as happens a lot of times, he just puts it aside. He just can't finish it because he can't crack it. But I think he always intended to come back to it. Here's an example of how he comes back to things. This is another unfinished painting from that period, the early years in Florence. And there's St. Jerome in the wilderness. The interesting thing is that he started his anatomy studies, but he hasn't done many dissections. But these things are truly show an anatomical knowledge of the skeleton, muscles, and nerves. Interestingly, the neck muscles are exactly right. In other words, there are two of them that cross, anatomically correct. What's interesting is at the same time, all of his drawings get it wrong. There's a neck muscle that's singular right there in one of the preparatory drawings, even a few years later for the Last Supper. So how come he gets it right then? Because he didn't paint that way on that neck back when he was a young painter in Florence. He does it, and like many other paintings, he's not quite sure it's right, doesn't finish it, puts it aside, and only recently, with technical analysis from infrared and ultraviolet, other multispectral ways of looking at it, we see the underdrawings, and we realize that when he originally painted, he got it wrong. 20 years later, he does real anatomy. This is from his anatomy dissection sheets, where he dissects the human neck, takes the skin off it, finds the double muscles that way. That's when he goes back 20 years later to perfect the neck of the St. Jerome. So one reason he doesn't give up his paintings, one reason he doesn't finish them, one reason he carries even the Mona Lisa for 16 years around with him to 4 cities in Italy and finally over the Alps to France, as he believes there's always another brushstroke. You can always make it more perfect. With all due respect to some of you art collectors in the room, he didn't dance to the music of his patrons. When a painting wasn't ready, he just wouldn't deliver it. I based the book on his notebook pages because right as he's ending his youth in Florence, before he moves away, he starts keeping a notebook. The notebooks are amazing. There are more than 7,000 pages of them. And unlike the great Kenneth Clark, who Eric mentioned, who wrote a biography in the mid-1900s of Leonardo based on his art masterpieces, I decided that the best way to show the holistic integrity of Leonardo's creativity was using the notebooks as a basis, day by day, week by week, looking at the lists of things to-do lists he put in his notebook. This is just one sample page. Paper is a little expensive, so fortunately he crams things on it. We see the craggy old man like the one he does in the pageants. But because he's trying to figure out the patterns of nature, he draws a tree right there with branches. And he comes up with what is now known as Leonardo's law of branching, which is pretty simple, which is that when the trunk of something branches into two branches, each of the branches has half the area of the original trunk, or if it's three branches, 1/3 of the area. And he discovers from his dissections that is like the anatomy of veins. So we have the tree going into the anatomy of veins. We also have the back going into a triangle and a circle, because he's interested in the mathematical issue, which you see here, of transforming one shape into a straight shape into a curved shape, known as squaring the circle. Can you make a circle the same size as a square using only a protractor and ruler? What he did not know is the answer is no, you can't. Pi is a very irrational number, but throughout his life, he's always trying to square the circle. We see it here. It devolves into mountain ranges. Once again, the geometric drawings of doing it, but also the geometric drawings helping him show how light hits a curved surface. And then there are those swirls of air, swirls of water, becoming curls of hair, which we see throughout his work. But the coolest thing is he always has a to-do list, things he's discovered. Here at the very bottom of this long list of things, he had something that puzzled me at first, which is how you boil in oil certain types of nuts and turn it into a tawny, i.e. dark blonde, hair dye, and how you'd apply it. And then I realized, here he is, now starting in hitting his 30s, somewhat vain. We've seen how pretty he is. We've seen what a good-looking guy he is. We've seen that he, too, has really long, flowing curls. He's worried about going gray. He's starting to dye his hair blonde. Makes me think, yes, he's human. That is really cool. He is gay and quite comfortable with it, unlike Michelangelo, who at the same period is gay and has the agony and ecstasy that comes from the torment you could have. Fortunately, Florence is a very tolerant city. In fact, the name for homosexuality in German at the time was Florenzer, meaning a Florentine, because Florence was known for its tolerance. And you go through all sorts of his friends, from Botticelli on. Leonardo was arrested twice for sodomy. It wasn't purely tolerant, but both times the cases are dismissed by the Medici, who one of their relatives as part of the crowd that had gotten arrested. So, you know, they're pretty cool with it. And Leonardo, at this point, has his first serious boyfriend, Salai, nickname meaning the little devil, because he keeps stealing and nicking objects. But throughout Leonardo's life, there are about 40 drawings of Salai with, as somebody, a contemporary, wrote, the golden curls that Leonardo so loved. We see the craggy old warrior, and in the notebook, over and over again, portraits of Salai. But at age 30, having not totally hit it out of the ballpark as a painter in Florence, having left those two paintings I showed you and some other things unfinished, Adoration of the Magi was a commission his father helped him get and had notarized the commission. Those of you who have 20-something kids and you help them get a job and they didn't finish it might know what the dynamics was like at that point. And Florence is pretty cool. It doesn't have an army. It decides that its influence is going to be partly based on soft power, cultural diplomacy. And so at one point, when the Duke of Milan had come to visit, they'd done the pageants, the one with the helmets, the Medici decide that they have to, you know, have an alliance with Milan, and they send a cultural delegation led by a poet, an ambassador who was a writer, and Leonardo as a musician, of all things, because he had designed and built a beautiful lyre for the arm, like a violin, but in the shape of a lion's head. And he and a companion, Atalante, go there to Milan to, as part of the cultural delegation to give the musical instrument. But Leonardo, who's not that eager for some reason to get back to his dad and finish the Adoration of the Magi, decides to write a job application letter to the Duke of Milan. He wants to have new horizons. He wants to move to Milan. It is such a cool letter. The book begins with it because it's 11 paragraphs long, each one numbered. The first 10 paragraphs describe how good he is at engineering. He wants to be an engineer. He says, I can divert rivers. I can design wonderful public buildings. I can make weapons of war. He even draws the wonderful weapons of war with the size, cutting people and stuff. He talks about diversion of rivers and waterworks and hydraulics engineering. Only in the 11th paragraph does he say, I can also paint. And he certainly could. He ends up being hired by the Duke of Milan, does a lot of engineering, but the Duke of Milan has him, among other things, not just do weapons of war, but help build cathedrals and do paintings. One of the things that Leonardo was asked to do when he gets to Milan with a group of friends, because creativity is a team sport, as I said. He's doing with a group of people, is to put a Tiburio, which is what this is, a lantern tower at the crossing of the transept and nave, because this cathedral didn't have one. It was hard to do because it wasn't well designed. Leonardo believes that design and beauty stem from simplicity, that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. You will notice the cathedral in Milan has never been described as simplicity. It is a Gothic monstrosity. Leonardo hates it because he likes symmetrical churches. He and his friends design a Tiburio. This is not it. That is just an octagonal. And it was beautiful, but it, of course, didn't fit in with the Gothic design, so they end up just sticking with the Gothic design. But Leonardo and his friends decide to go to nearby Pavia and do a church, a cathedral, that is based on the principle not only of simplicity, but pure symmetry. A transept and the nave the same size, like a Greek cross, and reflecting simply the proportions of a human, the way Vitruvian, the ancient scholar, had said churches should be. So he goes with his friend Bramante, who's an architect I mentioned, an artist who becomes one of his closest friends. Bramante, we love him because not only is he one of Leonardo's best friends, but he paints a painting of himself in Leonardo, which he calls Heraclitus and Democritus. But this is Bramante, round-faced, balding, etc. We know exactly that's him. And of course, with those wonderful curls and the chin like that, there's Leonardo. And we're absolutely sure it's him, not only because of the pink and purplish clothing, which he famously wore, but there's his notebook in mirror script, the way Leonardo wrote, from right to left, because he was a left-hander. And so to make sure we know it's Leonardo, there's a notebook with Leonardo's very unusual mirror script writings. They go off and design churches together with their friends Francesco Giorgio and others, and these are all Leonardo drawings, how to keep it simple, how to keep it proportional, how to do a church. And when they study Vitruvian, and part of it is to have a church reflect the proportions of a human. Obviously this appeals to Leonardo. We've already seen how Leonardo loves the connection of the earth to humans, of spiritual things to the human body, that he wants to see that holistic connection. And so he does a work of extraordinary science, about 230 drawings doing all sorts of proportions. The proportion of the chin to the lip to the nose, the whole way, each of these hundreds of calculations, exactly how a body in motion, what the proportions are, and the measurements are. He also is still trying to square the circle. Trust me, this is from his first notebook pages to the end. He is obsessing. Because he's obsessive. He's OCD and ADD and depressive and manic and everything rolled into one. And thank God we didn't have a diagnostic manual. Otherwise, he would have put on some pharmaceutical regimen and he never would have painted the Mona Lisa. But here's one of many, many pages at the time where he's trying to say, all right, if you may put the circle in this way and you do a loon this way and you do a curve thing, you can square the circle. And he continues to try to do it. And there's the church they decide to work on, the Pavia Cathedral, which, as you can see, is about as different from the Gothic monstrosity of Milan, simple cross proportions. And the whole point is to make the proportions of a church, as Vitruvius said, reflect the proportions of the human. In fact, one reason they're in Pavia is that, Vitruvius, his manuscript, this ancient Roman, had been totally forgotten and lost. But along with the other things in the Renaissance, Poggio, who famously, discovers Lucretius, if you've read The Swerve, one of the manuscripts he discovers is Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture that say the proportions of a man, church, blah, blah, blah. And it's in the library of the castle in Pavia. So they all go to look at this. They all decide to draw the proportions of a man in the cosmos and in the universe. Francesco Di Giorgio, there's stuff by Bramante, Giacomo d'Andrea, who we particularly like because there's a dinner. This is in July 1491. We know the date. They have a dinner party at his house when they get back. And Salai, who's very young, just joined the retinue of Leonardo, the little devil boyfriend, is there, breaks a plate, and spills red wine, according to Leonardo in his notebooks. So we imagine them all trying to draw man in proportion with the church, making sure that Salai didn't spill wine on it. We have the drawings of them, and then we get to why Leonardo is Leonardo. This is the one he does. People think, he did this all on his own. No, I love to show in this chapter that it was a collaboration. It was, with a group of people. This was all part of something. It wasn't just him sitting in the garret somewhere saying, I'm going to draw a guy in a circle and a square. It is perfectly proportioned. Every single thing has been measured by him to be exactly right. Secondly, it does exactly what Vitruvius said. The navel should be the center of the circle, the genitals at the center of a square. Leonardo, who's been trying to figure out how to square a circle, figures out one very clever way to do this, which is that the circle goes higher than the square in order to square the circle. And, that face, it's a self-portrait. It is Leonardo standing naked in the earth and in the cosmos saying, how do I fit in? So it is an iconic work of unbelievable science, breathtakingly unnecessary beauty, and great spirituality. So the next time you see it on a coffee mug or a t-shirt, I hope you appreciate Vitruvian Man slightly more and know it's not a joke. He does all sorts, and I'll skip through some of these things, but he does a lot of mechanics. As I said, he loves to try to attempt the impossible. This is not a bad thing to try, because even though you will fail, you'll learn why you fail. This happens to be a perpetual motion machine. Water flows down, turns a screw, the screw brings the water back up, it's supposed to work. He finally figures out that'll never happen, because he figures out the concept of friction. So we see in his mechanical stuff. Then we see, too, his anatomy. Finally, he's starting to do the dissections I told you about, of the human eye, the skull, mastering the idea of the visual display of information. You cover up the left-hand side, it doesn't give you as much information about the sinuses, which Leonardo discovers, but if you put it together with the peeled-off side and the regular side, you see exactly how it all works. Once again, a combination of art and science. A combination of utmost beauty connected to engineering and innovation. He even does that when he works for Caesar Borgia, the warlord. He decides that he can't really build all these weapons that he's been talking about. But he creates what may be the best military innovation, perhaps, one of the top 10 of all time, which is the visual display of a map. They didn't have maps back then. They are all holed up in this tiny town of Imola. And there are three really cool characters together in this tiny town all winter. And this is in the late 1490s, early 1500s, right, that winter. It is Leonardo da Vinci, Niccolo Machiavelli, and Caesar Borgia. Niccolo Machiavelli is in charge of the writing, Borgia's in charge of the military, and Leonardo's in charge of creating something like a map. because Caesar Borgia decides and understands that his competitive advantage is surprise. He's going to be able to know more than his enemies and know everything there is. One reason I love it is I've been out to up to Bethesda, the Defense Mapping Agency. You see maps on the wall that are not all that different from this. Almost aerial view, but a slight angle, so you can see it. Three-dimensionality, color, just a perfect visual display of information. I'm going to skip through some of the paintings because I want you to buy the book. But one of the things I did like, this is among the Duke of Milan's mistresses. This is my favorite of the non-famous paintings, Lady with an Ermine, a mistress. Besides the sort of sfumato, meaning blurred lines that he does, he is trying to figure out how light strikes curved objects. As I told you with the Adoration of the Magi, he's trying to make the reflections of one object color the shadows of another. We see it under her chin. I mean, there's a spot of light that wouldn't exist because of the light coming up, but he's playing with it a little bit ham-handedly because it's the light reflecting off of her breast and the head of the ermine to color the shadow under her chin. But also, as I say, it's a narrative painting, an emotional narrative. This is not just a three-quarter profile like we saw in Ginevra da Vinci. This is a profile of a woman having emotional reaction and something happening. We can imagine that Ludovico has just come in from this direction and startled both the ermine and the lady. They have a mix of pleasure and slight apprehension. You try to figure out what emotion is behind those eyes and smiles, what protectiveness is behind the paw and the stare of the ermine. Suddenly we're getting paintings that are not just flat snapshots, that are not even like Ginevra da Vinci, but that are emotional narratives. And then comes, and is later, after 10 or 12 years in Milan, the Duke says, okay, I need a Last Supper. I need it for the refectory. And you see Leonardo's stage theatrics come alive. This is an accelerated perspective. The lines go back a little bit too fast. Where have you seen that? You've seen that at every theater you've ever been to make the stage look deeper, to make this look like a deeper room, lines going back. He even has to hide the fact that it would be weird by this, the table does it this way. And you see, too, that it is a dramatic narrative, not a moment. There's no such thing as a self-contained moment. As I said, everything connects to what happened before and afterwards. So we see the monks come in, they see the hand of Christ. The narrative starts when you look up, and Jesus says, one of you shall betray me. You watch it ripple out. These are groups of three, the apostles. It ripples out. It's already hit this group, and they're already saying, is it I, my Lord? And all the way to the end, the shock that happened. And even the narrative moment that comes afterwards, he that dippeth his hand, and there's Judas recoiling with the phrase, he that dippeth his hand. And even, I think, which comes a verse or two later in the Bible, or in two of the Gospels, the institution of the Eucharist, where he's reaching for the wine and the bread. Not only is it scientifically and beautifully a drama, but it shows the clever ways he even made it fit in. This is the room, so he has to trick the eye of perspective, because if you're standing here, the perspective is different than if you're standing up here or if you're coming in the room. So he has the sizes different to be a trick perspective, as if the vantage point is actually up here. And here's something I love. When I first saw it, the restoration 2 years ago, it struck me. There's a window here in the real refectory. And I don't think people had really taken heed of this. You look, and the light in the painting, as if every shadow, the light on this wall, as if it's lunchtime and the light is coming in from that window. This painting you'll hear a lot about. You probably have last week. What?
Equal time on the phone.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. This is a painting that is the only Leonardo in private hands. It was only re-authenticated as a Leonardo about 10, 15 years ago. I won't go through all of it. It's in my book. Fortunately, I have a lot of it in the book because suddenly, I think, and they even said so, Christie's called me and told me, they are putting it on sale November 15th. It goes on auction in New York. It is displayed starting this week in San Francisco. November 3rd, it'll be on 51st Street at Christie's. I think it'll go for $125, $150 million. It is Salvator Mundi, Christ the Savior of the world. There are many reasons in the book that nowadays we can authenticate that. There are many copies of it. We never knew which was actually Leonardo's and which was his students. But different ways of looking at the brushstrokes, also the pentimenti of the thumb, how it's changed from the underdrawing, things Leonardo would have done. Among the scientific things is he knows there are no sharp lines in nature, as I've said before. Things are the sfumato, unlike the Michelangelo technique. But weirdly, the hand is pretty sharp. Why is the hand sharp? He's just written a treatise on optical perspective in which he said if something gets a certain point closer to you, that's when the lines are sharpest. He's trying to show that the hand is coming towards you. It is much closer to you than Jesus. It makes the three-dimensionality I said of a two-dimensional plane work because a sharp hand makes it look like it's closer. It's a little bit bigger than it should be. It's perspective. But here's the weird science thing. That's a crystal orb. These are actually scientifically brilliantly accurate things called inclusions that are done the exact right way. He has been studying optics, studying orbs, studying concave mirrors, and studying crystal for Isabella d'Este, because Isabella d'Este, a rich patron, who he wouldn't paint her portrait, but he did say he would help her buy crystal. He knows all about crystal, but if you think of a crystal globe, what's weird here? What's weird is that it does not distort the robes of Jesus behind it. Go outside, get a goblet of water, go to an amusement store, buy one of those little globes, look through it, you'll see things are inverted and reversed the way they would be if you look through a crystal lens. There's actually an article in The Guardian that misquotes me yesterday, saying that makes me doubt whether it's a Leonardo. It says it raises doubt whether it's a Leonardo. I never said that. Because we know this is a Leonardo, the question is, why did he not have the crystal orb distort? The three possible reasons I explore in the book. One is that he didn't really know. Well, that's ridiculous. I show through his notebooks he has been doing crystal buying for the Isabella d'Este. He's been doing optics experiments. He's been doing lenses, everything else. The second is he knew that if he had made the robe things reversed and smaller, and it was sort of the odd thing it would look like, it'd be so distracting, it would ruin the beauty of the painting. So he's, just like in The Last Supper, does something artificial for the sake of beauty. I think that's probably right, but the explanation I like best of all is he knew it would distort. He knew very few people would know that, but some would. And he's indicating that Christ's shepherding of this world is miraculous, and there's a miraculous quality that's non-distorting in Salvator Mundi. I let the reader be the judge of what's the proper explanation. If you get it right, for $150 million, we will talk to a lot of people, maybe David Rubenstein, whatever. Somebody should buy it. It actually is not that expensive. I mean, people have spent $150 million on second-rate sailboats or something. I would buy this. I would put it on permanent loan at the National Gallery, and I would be a national hero. He has a rivalry, as I said, with Michelangelo. Michelangelo paints like a sculptor and sculpts like a sculptor. This is David, and Leonardo's on the committee to decide where to put David. Leonardo doesn't mind Michelangelo that much, but Michelangelo really hates Leonardo. I mean, they're just totally different. He's a very reclusive person. They get into a bit of a fight, and Leonardo says we should put the David, if you know the Uffizi, under the arches of the Uffizi where it won't be too intrusive and stuff. And this does not amuse Michelangelo. What Leonardo also does, rather oddly, and this is a notebook drawing of Leonardo from that argument, he says there should be a decent ornament, an ornamento decente, which is like a fig leaf put over the genitals because it's too distracting to have the genitals right there, which is unusual because we've seen Leonardo quite happily does a lot of nude drawings, But I think there was something about Michelangelo he didn't like. Oddly enough, they agree with him. And for the first 40 years of the statue, there is a decent ornament put on it. This is Michelangelo. They were both asked to paint battle scenes for the council hall, playing off the Rivalry. This is a sketch that Michelangelo does, and as you see, sharp lines, no blurring. Leonardo, you see once again, this is Leonardo's sfumato technique on the right with the Virgin and St. Anne. This is a typical Michelangelo with sharp lines, which is why Leonardo thought he was unsophisticated. Let me go back. They both are asked to paint battle paintings. They both do preparatory drawings, and they both, I think, kind of can't stand the competition. And Michelangelo quits and goes to Rome to paint the Sistine Chapel, and Leonardo quits to go back to Milan and finish the Second Virgin of the Rocks. Once again, just the anatomy drawings, which I love from the notebooks. He does the heart. He shows exactly how the swirl of water, those swirls he loves, explain the opening and shutting of the aortic valve of the heart. People had thought it was because of pressure, as the blood goes up, goes down, closes the valve, but Leonardo said, no, that would crumple the valve. He knows that a spiral has a centrifugal force to take a membrane and spread it out. And thus, that spreading out is what closes the heart valve. And he even builds different contraptions to test it, including a glass thing where he puts grass seeds. He's showing how experiments and theories go hand in hand, beginning of the scientific revolution. But one of the things I love is you get to one of the heart drawings and another of the pages where he's doing it, and his mind wanders. And he draws the heart, and he can't help himself. He draws Salai around it. So once again, we know from his notebooks he's human, and that he loves the connection of anatomical scientific genius with the beauty of art and displaying it. And all throughout his life, interested in those ripples of water. We always have seen water. Every morning we see water flowing into a basin, a bowl. We do not look to see exactly what spirals form. Dozens and dozens of pages in his notebook are showing how spirals form when they hit things, and he ponders it his whole life because he loves that form. And finally, we culminate with the Mona Lisa. Now, once again, we know it's a thing of absolute beauty, but I want to show why all of this science, which Kenneth Clark said was a waste of Leonardo's time. He should have been finishing the Adoration of the Magi. No, had he not done the science, I don't think he would have had such a feel for the patterns of nature. There's multiple pages where he dissects the human face, skins this skin off cadavers of the face, and draws exactly how the lips work, which muscles are there. And this is just one of the pages. Some of them are much more detailed. Every muscle, every nerve, whether the nerve connects to the brain or the spinal cord. A true understanding of the lips, how you can move your lower lip alone because it's the muscle that purses it, but you can't move your top lip in the same way alone because it's controlled by the muscle that controls your lower lip. Things you and I could have figured out one morning while looking in the mirror, but we're not Leonardo. The cool thing is he's figuring out things that aren't like tensor calculus to describe the curvature of space and time like Einstein's doing. He's doing things that we could have noticed and can notice if we just train ourselves to be more observant. The cool thing, the reason I take this page, which is not his best anatomy page of the lips, is it's about the 12th page, and in light chalk, we see him start to do something. That's the beginnings of the Mona Lisa smile. So we can see almost directly the connection of the art and science. Once again, the dissection of the human eye, how when light hits the exact center of our retina, it sees detail, he says. When it hits the edges of our retina, it sees shadow. And so all of it comes together in the greatest painting, in my mind, ever done. And I will just take the smile. Besides having every movement of the lip exactly right, if you look really carefully at the smile, the tiniest of details on the corners of the lips, the tiniest details right at the edges, turn down slightly. There's just one or two almost imperceptible, detailed points that show a downturn. But the shadows and the colors turn up. What does that mean? It means he knows from his study of the human retina that if you're staring directly at her smile, it's elusive. It's a little hard to see. She may not actually be smiling. What is she thinking? As your eye just drifts to her chin or her cheekbone or her forehead, the light is coming in to the edges of your retina a little bit more, and she starts to smile. It's augmented reality. It's interactive. It smiles and stops smiling depending on how you interact with it. It is the mysterious, elusive smile. The closer you look, the harder it is to see. But there's something very spiritual about how, as you look at her, she looks at you, because the eyes, I could also go in the science of the eyes, they're always looking at you. She interacts with you, you interact with her. And once again, just as in Leonardo Da Vinci, down the street, there's the rivers from the eons of time, connecting to the roads that humans build, connecting to the veins in our body, to make it absolutely clear that not only is this about us and our cosmos, but it's also about how we fit into creation. He goes to France carrying that painting. After 16 years, it's still by his, bed, always putting small little perfections on it. Never, by the way, delivering it to that poor cloth merchant who had just married Lisa, because he's painting it for himself as a universal painting. There's his bedroom that the King of France gives near the Chateau of Amboise, where Leonardo gets his own great manor house. But in the end, he's still a bit tormented, doing the swirls and curls of the deluge. And on his very last notebook page that we have Leonardo talking about various things he's interested in, but still doing the geometric thing of how do I make a shape in one size equal the area of a shape in another. Euclid had tried it with right triangles. If you vary the length of the leg, how you can do it, and this would be the first step in squaring a circle. We even have a chart that, labels each one of these, and he explains how it's done. And at the very end, the line dribbles off, there's something lighter, and he writes, but the soup is getting cold. We can imagine, there he is, in his room. Downstairs is the big dining hall. All of his students and acolytes and apprentices and associates and friends are there. He has a cook named Madeline. In fact, he gives her a cloak in his will. And we can imagine that even though he's old and even though he's dying, he's still trying to square the circle, just like on his deathbed, Einstein was still trying to do equations of the unified theory. But the soup is getting cold. And thus he dies, some say in the arms of the King of France, like this painting. As everything, there's a bit of a mystery. King of France had signed a proclamation from a town that was 2 days away. On the other hand, he hadn't actually signed it. His chancellor signed it. Maybe he stayed back with Leonardo. But as with everything with Leonardo, there's just a wonderful mystery. Thank you all very much. I've now gotten into exactly an hour, too, but it meant you missed out on the Virgin of the Rocks. Yes?
So one day you wake up and you say, aha, I'm going to write a book on Da Vinci. And how does it come together for you?
How did it come together when I woke up one day and said I would do it? Well, first of all, slowly, just as Leonardo discerns patterns, although I don't want to compare myself to him, I discern patterns in what I'm interested in, which is this connection of art to science causing creativity from Ben Franklin to Steve Jobs. And so it clearly begins to dawn on me that the ultimate culminating book of the series should be Leonardo. Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester. I happened to be invited over so he could show it to me. His curators were going through it. He says, this was years ago, somebody's got to do Leonardo not as a painter, but as a person of wide-ranging passions and curiosities. Steve Jobs' hero is Leonardo. And over that period, I'd be wandering around. Kathy studied in Florence as a, junior year abroad, or at least went to Florence her junior year. I'm not sure how much she studied. So we'd go back, and then I'd run across the notebook in Milan on the Codex of the Flight of Birds. I'd be at the Morgan Library here, and they'd be showing off a codex. Or Bill would show a notebook, or thanks partly to Eric Motley and Mercedes Bass, I met David Lindley, nephew of the Queen, who is a curator at Windsor of the drawings, and he invited me to go see the anatomy drawings that are at Windsor. So I'm starting to see the notebooks, and it starts to dawn on me, not only do I have to do Leonardo, but I have to do it with the foundation being these notebooks. They're 7,000 or so pages, as I said. They've never really been, in 1890, a guy named J.P. Richter, about half of them are brought together. But nobody ever went through them chronologically and methodically.
Did you read Mirror Handwriting?
No, Marco Ciacci, who's the first acknowledgement in the book. Some of you were at the Aspen this summer. I invited him over. He's a wonderful old scholar, art scholar in Florence, had been the translator for Carlo Pedretti, who was one of the scholars who did the notebooks. I found him, through friends at Aspen Italia. One of the guys there is a professor of intellectual history. He said, you got to meet Marco. He became my guide and translator, visited us this summer in Aspen, and there's a wonderful event we had, which he loved, which is in Venice, talking our way into seeing Vitruvian band, which is never displayed, but it's on the 4th floor of the Academy. And with the help of Giulio Tremonti, who had been finance minister, all these people, they're saying, show it. And there's me and Kathy and Marco sitting there with Vitruvian Man. Yeah.
I read something in the last several years about a movement that Mary Magdalene may have been associated.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene being in the Last Supper. What you read was probably a book far more famous than mine will ever be, which is the Da Vinci Code, written by Dan Brown, and the Tom Hanks movie, in which I've read it. I still have trouble following it exactly, but there's some basic conspiracy theory that there is discovered in the novel about Jesus having a child, et cetera, Mary Magdalene, and it's the Da Vinci Code. Obviously, The Last Supper is part of it. And in the Dan Brown book and in the movie, the character, can we put this back up, or is this too hard to do? The character to Christ, to Jesus is right. If you'll put it back onto, I don't know if we can. Anyway, in the Last Supper, I don't quite know how to get it to full screen, but they'll get it. I'll get the Last Supper up while we're working on it. Now I have to find out where the Last Supper was. I think it's further along near the end. That's not John. It's
Right there.
not she. It is John. So this character is Mary Magdalene, according to the Da Vinci Code. And it's a secret thing that Leonardo did to give the clue of this whole very complex conspiracy. No, that's John. We have all the prep drawings. We know all the things. One of the things Dan Brown, who I've met and like, and I think it's a great novel, but he keeps insisting, well, it's really true. Well, no, it's not. But he says one of the things we know about Leonardo is he always made clear distinctions between male and females. He, never blurred the distinction. No. I mean, you can go back. This is one of the angels, Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks. This is a male angel. This is Gabriel, but, it's very androgynous. Leonardo, I'm sure I can find many other examples, starting with the angel in Tobias, or this angel. I mean, this is not, if you talk about androgynous, this is a male angel, but and, well, anyway. So, no, I don't think that's right. I do think it's a great novel. I hope to sell a small percentage of what he sold. But Leonardo DiCaprio is making the movie based on this book, and we hope that Mary Magdalene will not make an unnecessary appearance in one of the paintings.
Are the film rights more profitable than the book rights?
No, I mean, the film rights are complicated. They don't usually always make films. I'm not somebody who cares much about Hollywood. I don't go around trying to get points or being consultant or whatever. So you just sell it a bit. Yeah, I'm not a Hollywood person. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a wonderful presentation, Walter.
Thank you.
Last year, my wife and I were in Vinci, and it's a gorgeous.
In where?
Vinci.
Oh, Vinci.
Da
Yeah.
Vinci. Vinci.
Vinci.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful little town, and there's a museum there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. Were you there? Did you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm surprised then that you didn't make note, because one of the things that really took our eyes was this armor that he created, this weaponry. It was like a tank.
Yeah.
And a terrific model, and I'm surprised that...
Well, I did. I mean, if you'll flash the screen back up, I was trying pretty hard to keep this, if you'll flash it back up, I was trying pretty hard to keep this to an hour. And so among the drawings I flash over are some of his. Now, the tank, interestingly enough, wouldn't have worked. The gears are actually, one of them is reversed. And once again, it's like the orb in the Salvator Mundi. Did he do it because he wanted to make sure nobody would copy it, or did he make a mistake? I think the former. But I could give an hour presentation on his military machines, and I think I even flashed up the crossbow. The thing about his military machines is they bordered on fantasy, and most of them were not actually executed on the battlefield. That said, you're right, we could do an hour on the military machines. Yes? Who's that? Yeah, way back. Sorry, I can't see.
Isaacson, I'm Todd Wiggins. I'm
Todd.
very interested in his involvement in classical order of that architecture that applies to Washingtonian federal buildings, the Doric, the Tuscan, composite, and Corinthian orders.
Mm-hmm.
Did he have any, how much influence was he in
Well, he liked
executing those?
classical architecture, as in Vitruvius, but he did not. Most of his architecture is not what we would call the federal style, and it was not. Even though he at one point studied some of the Roman classical buildings, most of what he designs in his notebook are not sort of colonnaded, austere, Parthenon-like classical. But his taste in architecture was a little bit more Renaissance. I mean, it helped define Renaissance taste. Yeah. Larry?
You, in previous speech that I heard you give, you talked about the importance of paper.
Yeah. Paper. Well, the cool thing about, is that it? Yeah. Cool thing about Leonardo's notebooks. When I was writing about Steve Jobs, I tried to, with him, get some of the emails he wrote in the 1990s. Some of them were written on the Next computer, which, if you remember, was the one he did while on hiatus from Apple. And even with the techies, he couldn't retrieve his email. He couldn't retrieve some of the documents. The operating system is out of, doesn't exist anymore. Paper is an incredibly good technology for the storage of information and the retrieval and transmittal of information. 500 years from now, from him doing it, we can still flip through his notebook pages. And I think it's really important. One of the many lessons I have on Leonardo in the last chapter is take notes, make lists on paper in a notebook. Because 50 years from now, your grandchildren are going to be able to see your notes. Just like 500 years from now, we can see Leonardo's. And that's not going to be true of your tweets and your Facebook posts, and certainly not your MySpace posts, if any of you remember what MySpace was. Things will come, and Snapchat will come and go, but paper will be here 50 and 500 years from now. Yeah.
Walter, thanks again. Yesterday, President Trump was asked a rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how he thought the Puerto Rican adventure had gone. And I'm interested in your doing something similar on the sort of degree of difficulty on the 4 major biographies that you've done.
I think that the most difficult was Steve Jobs, because he was a brilliant, sensitive, spiritual, but difficult character, and he was dying. And he was getting sometimes mean to people, as he had been throughout his life. When he occasionally get mean, he'd tell me things that were slightly mean, partly because he was probably upset, partly because he was on painkillers. And you had to figure out, okay, these are real people I know, and he's saying certain things about it. And so there was always a bit of a discomfort there, as much as I admired and even loved many aspects of him. All right, last 2 questions, because they both popped up.
Yes, sir. Do you think there's still some notebooks that have not been discovered?
Yeah, the notebooks have not been discovered. The notebooks we have, we can estimate are approximately 1/4 of the number he wrote, which, by the way, is great. I mean, everyone goes, wow, but I mean, let us take all the notebooks you may have done and all the to-do lists you may have done, and 500 years from now, what percentage of those, will still be around? Melzi, his second major boyfriend after Salai, was a more aristocratic, learned person, kept the notebooks after Leonardo dies, is very careful with them. As some of you know, the Brits, especially minor members of the aristocracy, like Lord Elgin goes to Greece and takes the marbles. Lord Leicester, among others, takes some notebooks, or whoever takes them. They end up scattered, some in Windsor, some in, wherever. So they do disappear after a while. About 45 years ago, I think, maybe a little bit longer, 2 of them reappeared in the National Library of Madrid, a really, really old section of the National Library, where they had been miscatalogued and misshelved. And somebody was looking for some book and pulls it down. It's a Leonardo notebook. They're now called the Codexes or Codices Madrid, and they have all, in fact, I'm not absolutely sure, I think this crossbow is in it. A lot of the mechanical drawings are in it. So things reappear. Salvator Mundi reappeared. A La Bella Principessa, a chalk drawing that he did, was discovered about 30 years ago and authenticated about 10 years ago, when it was clear that it was taken out of a notebook or a frontispiece of a book that Leonardo had drawn. So I think we will discuss, there's always something new to discover about Leonardo. Yeah, last question.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and I don't think I ever learned that Leonardo was gay.
Oh.
And
Salai knew.
Right. And I'm just curious if you could comment on the fact that so much of his work is centered around his, Christian themes. And you talk in the book about, at the end of his life, he wanted to be informed of Catholic teaching. And I wondered if you could just share, at that time, being gay in the church.
First of all, the Catholic Church was not exactly quite as strict or whatever as it has been at other times. Pope Alexander, whatever, of the time had quite a few illegitimate children. Certainly the Medici popes, Caesar Borgia was one of the illegitimate children of the Pope at the time. And as I say, it was complex, the feelings towards male-to-male romance and attraction. Dante puts it in a circle of hell, but, then praises his teachers who were gay and openly so. Florence was particularly tolerant of it. The church, it didn't prosecute it. Now, and this is somewhat relevant to our time, there was a right-wing populist puritanical backlash that happens in 1494, I think. Savonarola, a very strict evangelical friar, basically helps oust the Medici and becomes a ruler of Florence. Famously, there's the bonfire of the vanities. There's also persecution of sodomy, which, as I say, when Leonardo was arrested, it was just nothing ever happened. So you have, and then he gets ousted after 4 years because they decide, boy, this was a mistake. So you have a period in which things go back and forth. But Leonardo questioned a lot of biblical teaching because he questioned all received wisdom because he was a disciple of experience. He looks at the fossils when he's a young kid. He discovers fossils near the Arno River and near Vinci. And then over his life, he's always doing studies of fossils. In fact, one of the cool things in Virgin of the Rocks is the fossils are exactly right. These are two versions he did of it. And he writes in his notebooks that if you look, and he discovers, he's the first ever to discover trace fossils, which means not fossils of a living organism, but the traces that organism left, like in the sand or whatever, like when it crawled, and that becomes fossil. Saying it proves they were alive when they made these fossils. From that, after a few pages, he deduces that the biblical flood did not happen. That's not the way all these things happened, that it was over the course of centuries and millennia that these strata have been laid down, and he's perfectly comfortable saying, no, our, experience shows that the way the Bible teaches is not right when it comes to the flood. He even questions the fetus in the womb, whether it has viability in a soul. Now, he's still a member of the church. When he dies, he takes, Vasari as our witness, or he wasn't actually there, but writes about it, and I think he probably embellishes a bit, but saying that Leonardo, who hadn't really been that religious, on his deathbed asked to be given the final rites and the teachings of the church but he's not like Michelangelo, who every day, as I say, and as the book title has it, the other books, the agony and the ecstasy of religion. Leonardo was a disciple of experience. Thank you all very much. I'll go sign books if you want.
Thanks a lot.
Great.